Hi, welcome back to our channel. So today we're going to look at chapter number 7 of The Ending of Time, and I'm going to have to rely on my notes. So I'll be looking down quite a bit, forgive me for that. So the chapter starts out making two rather bleak propositions. One, that man is mostly ruled by his animal instincts, and second, introducing thought into the mix hasn't dampened the adverse effects of instinctual behavior, but made the situation worse. So we have these two seemingly opposite ways of being, instinctive on the one hand and rational on the other, and neither of them seem to be conducive to peaceful coexistence. And when we revisit the findings of the last chapter, we can summarize it in two hypotheses that just to sort of establish a solid ground for today's discussion. The first one being insight changes the nature of the brain itself, and the second one, insight allows the brain to function in a new way. Now I think that it's important to make this distinction because the first hypothesis points to the actual physical makeup of the brain, while the second one points to its way of functioning, the way the brain processes information. So both are said to change by there being insight. And I think it's worthwhile to go into the actual text for a short period of time. So, thought has been operating in darkness, creating its own darkness and functioning in that. And insight is, as we said, like a flash which breaks down the darkness. Then, when that insight clears the darkness, does man act or function rationally? Yes, man will then function rationally and with perception rather than by rules and reason. But there is a freely flowing reason. You see, some people identify reason with certain rules of logic, which would be mechanical. But there can be reason as form of perception of order. So we are saying, are we, that insight is perception? It is the flash of light which makes perception possible. Right, that's it. It is even more fundamental than perception. So insight is pure perception, and from that perception there is action, which is then sustained by rationality. Is that it? Yes. Now let's capture the essence, or let's try to capture the essence of this paragraph. So insight is not to be understood as some type of information that is somehow injected into the brain. Rather, it is more like a different mode of operation of the brain, which is here equated with pure perception. Also, rationality is not to be understood as the adherence to a fixed set of rules, but as the conditions that allow for the continuity of pure perception. And thirdly, there seems to be something that pure perception is prone to perceive, and that is order. So next, let's revisit a finding again from the last chapter, which is that different mode of operation, which we equate with insight or pure perception, cannot come about as long as there is a sense of self or I or ego, which is bound to time. And with time, in that, when we refer to time in that context, we mean what they coined psychological time. So it becomes apparent when we pursue the question, how a state of pure perception could be obtained. And the very proposition that, wanting to obtain something points to an agent, and points to an agent which is the self, the ego, or the I, and who does the wanting, So even if we conceive of the wanting as a wanting to become different, or a different kind of self, we are left with the self that is bound to time. So there seems to be a circularity, circular sort of argument there. And so one cannot produce at will, from the perspective of that self, ego, or I, this flash of insight, which is said to change everything, One cannot pursue it in the sense of wanting to become, because becoming is situated in psychological time and always points to a self, an ego, or an I. And it is an I that is pursuing something. So it cannot also be obtained through sacrifice, nor is it somehow given to one by some higher authority, which one considers to be another, or other than self, other than ego, other than I. What is being proposed, though, is that there is at least one fictional character which they keep referring to as X, just X, to whom this insight seems to be natural, or having this insight seems to be natural, or being in that mode of operation in insight seems to be natural, and who also embraces that. And they then launch into the discussion of how insight can seem so natural to this person X, and how it can, on the other hand, seem so unnatural or unusually, to the majority of people who are trapped in time, who are sort of residing in that notion of I-ness and me-ness, and sort of perceive everything from that vantage point. And I think it's worthwhile to review a short excerpt about that again. If we say that pleasure and pain, fear and hate are natural, then it is felt that we must battle to control these, otherwise they will destroy us. The best we can hope for is to control them with reason, or through another way. But that doesn't work. Are people like X, who function differently, the privileged few, by some miracle, by some strange chance event? Many people would say that. But it goes against one's grain. I wouldn't accept that. Well, if that is not the case, then you have to say why there is this difference. That is what I'm trying to get at, because X is born of the same parents. Yes, fundamentally the same. So why does he behave differently? What follows is a discussion whether the difference is one of degree or one of kind. And it is concluded that we are not talking about a difference in kind. And we can qualify this with a couple of hypotheses. I think that's best. So the first one is, fundamentally people have the capability to operate on insight. The second one, a difference between those who operate on insight and those who do not is not intrinsic or structural. And the third one, technically everyone has the opportunity to switch from one operating on ego consciousness to operating on insight. at all times. Now, this is really crucial because we're back in the discussion of agency. People that are ruled by thought or by the notion of I consciousness are bound to time. And the very concept of having an I or a self or an ego is what sort of constantly perpetuates the division, and does not allow one to enter this different mode of operation. And Krishnamurti puts it well when he says, "How am I to dispel this continuous, constant darkness? That is the only question, because as long as that exists, I create this constant division. You see, this is going round in circles. I can only dispel the darkness through insight, and I cannot have that insight by any effort of will, so I am left with nothing. So what is my problem? My problem is to perceive the darkness, to perceive the thought that is creating darkness, and to see that the self is the source of this darkness." So here we get a description on how the brain, by processing, apparently by processing sensory data and producing thought, sort of constantly creates, and as a byproduct, so to speak, the notion of an agent or a separately existing ego or I, and it also constantly reinforces that notion, by processing sensory data and producing thought. So it is a self-perpetuating motion. It is sort of like a closed loop, if you will. And as far as the ego or I is a byproduct of thought or construct, one cannot get out of that closed loop from that very vantage point of I-ness and me-ness. So it's a conundrum, And further, they discuss the possibility that solely by listening to someone like X, who has realized that there is such a closed loop and that the notion of ego or I is nothing but a construct, one has the chance to have the same realization. And in such realization, the notion of I or me would then be shattered. So I think one could talk about this at length, in itself, because what it really says is that in order for, granted that there's always going to be people, new people, new human beings born, and granted that humanity somehow is able to perpetuate itself, there's always going to be that propensity to, live in ego consciousness or in I consciousness, and the only way out of I consciousness or ego consciousness is for there to be at least one individual that has realized this and is able to talk about it, and for others to listen and to actually understand what's happening. So. And what is important to note also is that once this notion of ego has been shattered, it is sort of permanent. So the shattering of the ego is permanent. So it's once one had this type of realization, there doesn't seem to be a way back, which is probably a good thing, I guess. So you can't you can't have this realization or go through this sort of ego death and then go back to living in that egoic sort of state of mind. One has changed one's perspective on oneself from being a sort of separately existing entity to taking part in and also being couched in a overall sort of movement, a sort of flow of consciousness, of for lack of a better term, one could say universal type of consciousness, So in order to solidify that idea, let me try and summarize the rest of the chapter in a series of arguments, which paraphrases what has been said. The movement is the ground of all being. Now, we're just clarifying terms. We're clarifying what they mean, by, for instance, movement. Somehow there's a lot of treating terms, on an equal footing. So, for instance, they call insight, they equate insight with movement. So it's really important to kind of revisit, what they mean by singular terms. So the movement is the ground of all being. It has no beginning, no end, and no form. The movement is all enveloping. It is the world, the universe, the cosmos, the whole. It is timeless and eternal. The mind partakes in that movement. The mind emerges from the movement as a ground and falls back to the ground. Death is but the ending of the body. The very perception of this affects the brain. The fear of death and the fear of not becoming vanishes. Once the brain, the brain never loses the quality of that movement once it has obtained it, or it has it, or it has. See, it's really, you have to be really careful with what you say here. Once the brain entered that mode of being, it sort of, it stays in that mode of being. It cannot go back to being in the mode of ego consciousness. Such a brain is no longer consumed by psychological time, and out of that kind of being, compassion can emerge, which is a hopeful note. They don't really say, they don't expand on that, and I'm not going to either, because what I want to make sure is that I actually stick to the text and don't bring in so much my own ideas or conclusions. So yeah, I think that, and I have to say, a lot of times when one reads this book, there seems to be a lot of meandering, but it's misleading, because it's, and I think if you really take your time, and if you really take the time to appreciate this text, and you can actually listen to the conversation, the original conversation. I'm always linking to a recording of the actual conversation in the description box. So you can either read the transcript or listen to the conversation. And when you do, you will find with time that it's the conversation. It's a movement, in itself, and it's like a symphony, actually, and it sort of, there is meandering at times, but there is also a sort of fundamental harmony that goes through the whole conversation. And I think what they do quite well is that, and that probably wasn't planned at all, is that we have two very different kinds of people. We have Jiddu Krishnamurti on the one hand, who is, or seems at least, to be quite a, emotional and I don't know how to say that, like a lyrical, musical, or artful type of person, whereas David Bohm comes more from the scientific and the factual and the precise, sort of corner. And in their exchange, I think they work quite well with each other, because Krishnamurti sometimes is really is not pause. Sometimes Krishnamurti is not very precise, in the way he uses terms, and sort of uses them repeatedly and all of a sudden gives them a different meaning. And David Bohm usually realizes that, and then, you know, really pins Krishnamurti down and says, well, we have to be careful, you know, we have to define this term. And so it's a really nice conversation, and not just for the actual content, but just the way they interact with each other, and that can be appreciated in itself. So I hope this was a short one. I hope you could take something away. If you could, please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.